This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. This is going to be released as a bonus episode. I think it's going to come out on Thanksgiving of 2023. I like to throw you guys some extra episodes during the holiday seasons, and now that I've kind of worked it out with LCI where I can do more than just my Tuesday schedule through LCI, I definitely wanted to give you guys a couple of bonus episodes, especially when it's an episode that touches on an issue that might be relevant to the show, but maybe is not specifically addressed on a week-to-week basis on this show, like the episode that we are going to be recording today. So I hope that you enjoy this special bonus episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. And if you are listening to this on Thanksgiving, then happy Thanksgiving. So as many of you guys know, I am a middle school teacher, and in particular, I teach 7th grade social studies. And in the state of Kentucky, 7th grade social studies is the medieval world. So it's the global Middle Ages, but we do have a heavy emphasis on European history. And before I started this podcast, pretty much everything that I read was either biblical studies or ancient or medieval history, because I wanted to do a really good job at work presenting the information to my students. And I think that if you are a public school teacher and you're being paid by the taxpayers of your county, you should actually be providing value to those students. And so for me, I took all of the time off that I had to listen to these podcasts on the Middle Ages and read these books on the Middle Ages. And when I began this podcast, I had to shift my reading a little bit. I started reading a lot more political philosophy and a lot more economics, and all of that is good. But I've been kind of slowly working my way back more towards biblical studies and more towards medieval history, because in reality, I love economics too. That's another very important subject to me. In reality, those are really, I could spend the rest of my life reading only those three things: biblical studies, works on medieval and ancient history, and then works on economics. That's just what I'm in philosophy too. I like a little bit of philosophy there. I try to read a couple of books a year just to keep my mind sharp. And so I try to be in the habit of reading these books on the Middle Ages, and I'm kind of working my way back into that. This fall, there has been a really great book on the Middle Ages that I read by a medievalist named Norman Cantor called Inventing the Middle Ages. And I think Norman Cantor passed away in the 2000s. He was fairly old. This book came out, I believe, in 1991. But this book by Norman Cantor, like I said, it's called Inventing the Middle Ages, is an incredible book. And in a lot of ways, it is very similar to Albert Schweitzer's The Quest of the Historical Jesus, in that it is not necessarily a book about the history of the Middle Ages. It's a book about medieval historians, medievalists. And Norman Cantor goes to show in this book, as you can kind of guess from the title, Inventing the Middle Ages, that our perception of the Middle Ages is shaped by the social and historical context of medieval historians. And so he goes through all of the great medievalists of the 20th century and demonstrates how their social and cultural context actually shaped their scholarship on the Middle Ages, and the emphases that they chose and the way that they chose to interact with and engage with the primary source data. All of it was determined to a large extent by their social, cultural, academic, historical context. It's a really interesting book that doesn't deconstruct what we know about medieval history, but it tries to place it in its proper context and suggest, just like Albert Schweitzer does in The Quest for the Historical Jesus, that we might have to go back and rethink a lot of what we know about the Middle Ages, and we have to at least be aware that the medievalists that were producing the histories of the Middle Ages in the 20th century were very much influenced by their cultural context and did not have an unbiased reading of medieval history. Now, there's a really great chapter in this book for my audience. I know you guys will be interested. There's a really great chapter on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, two of the greatest Christian thinkers of the 20th century. A lot of people don't realize that Lewis and Tolkien were actually medievalists, and I think Tolkien focused, and Lewis might have as well, specifically on medieval literature. And one of the points that he's got a great chapter called The Oxford Fantasist on Lewis and Tolkien, and he makes the point, which I think is completely accurate, that like 99% of the West's popular perception of the Middle Ages is derived from the works of Lewis and Tolkien, because they set out these themes that they believe were medieval in these great works of literature, the Chronicles of Narnia for C.S. Lewis, and of course Lord of the Rings for Tolkien. And there's some really interesting passages in there. I get the sense from Cantor that he might be a little bit sympathetic towards libertarian ideas just from the way that I read through his book. But in the sections on Lewis and Tolkien, there's a really interesting passage passage where he talks about how Tolkien was very explicitly critiquing human power in Lord of the Rings. And I really do think that Lord of the Rings does represent kind of the greatest Christian philosophical and narratival critique of power outside of the Bible. So our perception of the Middle Ages is definitely derived from those two scholars, but he has an even more interesting chapter for listeners of this show. And he goes over the two most influential American medieval scholars during the 20th century, and those two figures are Charles Haskins and Joseph Strayer. And he makes the point from the very beginning of the chapter on the two of them that both of them were radical Wilsonians, and they had a profound relationship with Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson's ideology was impressed upon both of them. And he's going to go on to explain how Wilsonian values influenced their understanding of the Middle Ages and especially medieval social structures like feudalism. Really, really, really interesting insights in these chapters. And in fact, this is chapter 7 of his book. It's titled American Pie, and it's on Haskins and Strayer. And the very first section is simply called the Wilsonians. And he just lays out the way that these two scholars were both influenced by Woodrow Wilson, and Haskins actually wound up working for him and was instrumental in drafting the Treaty of Versailles, believe it or not. And then how those Wilsonian impulses towards centralized government and efficient bureaucracy and all of those things were read back into medieval history. Now, I'm going to do something that I don't usually do on the show today, and I know that this might not be for everybody, but we are going to read that entire section in its entirety. Now, I know a lot of people don't want to listen to me read the book, but I'm going to try my hardest to make it as interesting as possible. Here's the thing. I was going to break this down, and I was going to try to draw out the most important elements of Cantor's narrative here, but it's just so good. The section is so good, and Cantor is such a great author, and I think you're going to be able to see that he has, while he has a lot of respect for Haskins and Strayer as medievalists, he also has a lot of, maybe scorn's not the right word, but he's definitely critical of their Wilsonian influences and the way that permeated their work on medieval history. And so I think it's just going to be really important to read this entire section to you guys at length. So this might be something, if you're listening to this on Thanksgiving, you can do as you're preparing your house. But we're going to go over how these two medievalists, the two greatest American medievalists of the 20th century, were both dramatically influenced by Woodrow Wilson and projected his ideas back into medieval history. So I'm going to read this section to you. It's great. It's going to take us a few minutes to get through this because it's about 10 pages long, but I just want to go through it, and I hope that you guys really get a sense and really have an appreciation for the ideas that Norman Cantor is going to develop as it relates to Haskins, Strayer, and their commitment to Woodrow Wilson. So here we go. He says this starting in the first section of chapter 7 of his book, The Wilsonians. While European views of the Middle Ages inevitably had a very strong impact in the United States, especially after the German émigrés began arriving in the mid-30s, a distinctive American school of medieval history developed after Charles Homer Haskins, 1870 to 1937, was appointed to a senior chair at Harvard in 1912. When the German émigré scholars in the 1930s found their bearings on the alien cultural shores of the United States, they found that most of the senior professorships of medieval history were held by Haskins students or by contemporaries of his who were in full sympathy with his ideas and methods. The leading professional association for medievalists of any kind, the Medieval Academy of America, had been founded principally by Haskins in the early 1920s. Its offices were still in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as they are today. Furthermore, the rising star in medieval history in the 1940s was Joseph Rees Strayer, 1904 to 1987, the chairman and senior professor of European history at Princeton, who not only was Haskins' students, but consciously maintained the approach to the Middle Ages that Haskins has inaugurated in America. In addition, Haskins and Strayer's distinguished and prolific publications were tightly situated in an American ideology, that of Wilsonian progressivism, called democratic liberalism since the 1940s and after 1968, Cold War liberalism by leftist critics. The Haskins-Strayer Wilsonian School of Medieval History and its special concentration on the subject of royal administration, political rationalization, and the medieval origins of the modern state, to quote the title of Strayer's best-known book, dominated medieval history in the United States until the late 1960s. It viewed the Middle Ages from an entirely different frame of reference from German Geschichte or formalism, but it gave a place to the German intrusions a dignified one intellectually, but a subsidiary one in terms of academic power. It was only with the triumph of leftism on American campuses after 1968 and the invasion of Frenchified social history of the Parisian Annales School and its ideological affinities to Marxism that the overwhelming hold of Haskins' Strayer Wilsonian administrative history substantially weakened in America. Yet it has not passed away by any means. The professor of medieval history at Harvard today, and remember he's writing this in 1991, so this has probably changed, but the professor of medieval history at Harvard today is Thomas M. Bisson, Strayer's student and giver of the memorial oration in the Princeton Chapel after Strayer's death in the summer of 1987. By both academic interest and personal temperament, Bisson is directly and unwaveringly in the Haskins-Strayer lineage. Haskins could come back to Harvard today, listen in on one of Bisson's lectures, and feel nothing had changed from the day in 1931 when he had a stroke and had to quit teaching. The tradition of Wilsonian ideology, as combined with and expressed through the administrative and political histories of the Middle Ages, continued unabated on the banks of the Charles. At Princeton, Strayer's student William C. Jordan, one of the two American black medieval historians, the fact that the other, Bennett Hill, at Georgetown University, is also Strayer's student, speaks to Strayer's paternalistic liberalism, continues the same tradition in Tigertown. These people and their Wilsonian rationalist culture are as American and as durable as Grandma's recipe for apple pie and as tasty. The impact of Woodrow Wilson on American culture in the 20th century probably exceeds that of any other man, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Wilson, as a president and as an international statesman, had a very mixed records of accomplishment and can probably be viewed as a domestic political failure and internationally as a disaster. The record of positive legislation of Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s or that of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the mid-60s was much greater than that of Wilson's. Nevertheless, it was Wilson who was the central figure in a kind of instrumentalist progressivism, a rationalist reformist, that permanently altered the way Americans thought about government, national destiny, and their role as citizens. Wilsonian progressivism is where modern America starts, and we are still groping to absorb, contend with, or fulfill the Wilsonian program of public service and international order, or trying feebly to formulate an alternative cultural structure by which we can also live and respect ourselves. The literature on the subject of Wilsonian progressivism, which is the intellectual crust for the Haskins-Strayer American Pie of medievalism, is substantial, although the definitive book on the subject has not yet been written. Woodrow Wilson came from an old Virginia middle-class family. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and he himself was much inspired by a Calvinist sense of personal calling to do great things and by a rigid ethical code. Wilson obtained one of the first PhDs in the country in history and political science from the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, which had been newly founded to offer German-type graduate program. By the late 1890s, Wilson was a famous teacher at Princeton, which was the favorite school for the scions of the Southern gentry, and he was perhaps the best-known political scientist in the United States, with a pioneering book on the operations of the U.S. Congress. After his elevation to the presidency of Princeton, Wilson became immediately one of the 3 or 4 most activist and best-known American college presidents of all time. He aimed to change Princeton from a college for the wealthy and genteel into a real university with important graduate programs and research interests. In that regard, he had only marginal success, and Princeton's full transformation into a major university occurred in the late 1940s and 1950s. Wilson's greatest achievement at Princeton was an undergraduate education. He introduced the preceptorial system, a variant of the Oxbridge tutorial program in which students met weekly in groups not larger than 7, with an instructor for a free-flowing discussion. It was not so much this small group tutorial focus as the complement of new instructors Wilson hired from the new graduate programs at Harvard and Yale to conduct the preceptorials that made the difference in Princeton education. They were a capable, well-chosen, and dedicated group of young professors who successfully balanced teaching and research responsibilities, and the blend distinguishes the Princeton faculty to this day. By 1912, Wilson was the Democratic candidate for United States president and was elected as the result of a split in the Republican Party. He was reelected in 1916 by the narrowest of margins after promising to keep the United States out of the war. Less than a year later, he persuaded Congress to declare war on Germany, ostensibly because of the draconian German policy of sinking neutral ships. The real reasons were the protection of American banks that had overextended themselves in loans to the Allies and Wilson's generic Anglophile Anglophilism, which meant the United States should not stay neutral when it looked as though Germany would win the war. This could be right out of a Rothbard book. The story of Wilson's activity at the Paris Peace Conference is well known. He played a leading role in redrawing the map of Europe on the basis of the application of the principle of political nationhood for Central and Eastern European ethnic communities, for example, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, created out of the ruins of the Austrian and Russian empires. But he could not prevent the British and French leaders from the imposing reparations on Germany that produced such resentment and economic crisis there as to cripple the new liberal Weimar Republic and pave the way for a violent reaction. Nor was the League of Nations Wilson devised an effective international body for collective peacekeeping, especially when the U.S. Senate rejected American membership in the League. Judgment upon Wilson and assessment of his character are as divided today as they were in his lifetime. He was a bundle of contradictions. He was ideologically very much a liberal Democrat, but his own behavior was invariably authoritarian, impetuous, and oblivious of the feelings and advice of others. This was partly due to his stern Calvinist religion, which made him believe he had a personal line to God, and partly the consequence of a high-strung disposition arising from unresolved Oedipal feelings and repression of his sexual urgings. This was the view of Wilson held by no less of a psychoanalytic authority than Sigmund Freud himself. Wilson tolerated suitably assimilated Jews and courageously made Louis D. Brandeis, the Boston lawyer and Harvard School guru, the first Jewish Supreme Court justice against bitter opposition within Congress and without. Brandeis had been one of his closest advisors. On the other hand, Wilson had a white Virginian's hostility to and contempt for African Americans. Segregation in the federal government offices actually increased during his presidency, and his mistreatment of a segregated black army regiment in Texas was cruel and disgraceful. William talked world peace and the comity of nations, but acted as a gross imperialist towards Mexico. On the one hand, he wanted to regulate the untrammeled robber baron style of capitalism that had developed in the late 19th century. On the other hand, he shrank from doing this effectively when he had the chance. Wilson was so Anglophilic that he could not maintain rational judgment on America's relationship to the great powers, nor did this disposition equip him to deal skillfully with the problems of Central and Eastern Europe. The Versailles settlement made stability and a long peace in Europe virtually impossible. It made the totally excluded Soviets hostile and searching for mischief. It created so many weak and unstable regimes in Central Europe as to generate incessant crises of one sort or another. Wilson can be and has been portrayed from his own day to our own as arrogant, bigoted, rash, fanatical, irrational in judgment, and ineffective in operation, a walking disaster for any institution he headed, whether a university, the United States, or an international peace conference. Yet he was a man who, at least before America's entry into the war in 1917, won the unswerving loyalty and the firmest admiration of a great part of the academic, professional, and intellectual elite of the United States, which saw him as one of the 2 or 3 best qualified presidents in American history, which envisioned him as the inaugurator of a new era for both his country and humanity. Possibly they saw what they wanted to see. They projected onto Wilson their hopes that the United States was coming of age, that the economic confusion and political chaos and social pathology produced by the huge industrial expansion of the late 19th century, the vast ill-digested inflow of immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe, the need for the advancements of learning and organized professions, and the exception of a significant and benign role for the United States internationally would be met in the Wilson presidency. Wilsonian progressivism signified an educated middle class seeking to gain power and extend its learning and code of rationality and efficiency to every walk of life. Wilsonianism's fundamental dogma was that centralizing power in the hands of an educated and professional elite was the salvation of the country. It had no qualms whatsoever about the corrupting tendencies or practical incapabilities of power. Science and humanistic learning could provide the answer for everything from slums, public health, sanitation, and crime in the cities to war and imperial control internationally, if only the right kind of people were in power. There was certainly a WASP or at least Northern European flavor to progressivism. It believed in a view of history in which wisdom and righteousness belonged to the Protestant nations of Western Europe, with some tolerance for the Parisians in Paris, obviously, and the Florentines. Catholic and Mediterranean cultures, the Slavic world, non-whites and Jews had little or no intrinsic credibility. However, the progressives were committed to upward social mobility, and at least all Caucasians. There was dispute about African Americans if by education and behavior modification they adopted the ideas, appearance, and lifestyles of the North European Protestants, especially the British, not the Irish, of course, could then be accepted into the elite. It is easy to criticize and make fun of Wilsonian progressives, but considering the vast problems the United States faced, the need for order and strong leadership, good government and the imposition of standards of civic virtue, it was almost inevitable that they would have these biases. The alternatives were not apparent, and it might be argued their cultural model, their ideals of what is right and not right, have prevailed to this present day with only a little softening at the edges. The stamp of Wilsonianism is still upon us. It is not just that Charles Haskins and Joseph Strayer, by circumstance of their academic status and their adherence to the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, were perpetuators of the Wilsonian heritage. Their character as Wilsonians goes much deeper than that. It is an effect of their biographies and their temperaments. They were Woodrow Wilson duplicated and reincarnated. Haskins and Strayer were not just Wilsonians who happened to be medievalists. Their interest in the Middle Ages and their construction of medieval government and administration were a projection of Wilsonian ideas onto the medieval European past, as well as a reliving and justification of the Wilsonian program from the lessons of the medieval origins of the modern state. The medieval political experience, as they understood it, sustained the value and exclusivity of the Wilsonian program in 20th century America. The personal style and behavior pattern exhibited by Haskins and Strayer, their psychological profiles, closely resembled Wilson's. Haskins came from an affluent family in Pennsylvania. He was a very precocious child, and his father, a well-educated man, taught him Latin and Greek before he was 7 years old. At the age of 15, Haskins entered a local school, Allegheny College, from which he sought the next year to transfer to Harvard. The dean of Harvard College, not unwisely, thought he was too young, but Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore accepted him, and there he continued his precocious ways. At the age of 20, he had a Ph.D. in American history from the institution and department that had graduated Woodrow Wilson a few years earlier, and he taught at the University of Wisconsin in Madison for a couple of years. Then Haskins decided to become a medievalist and left for Europe to get training at l'École des Chartes in Paris. The leading professor in American history at Madison in the 1890s was Frederick Jackson Turner, the inventor of the famous frontier thesis in American history, that the character of American civilization had been shaped by the open frontier that was in the early 90s in course of closing. By studying medieval history, Haskins was going to find how another frontier-conditioned society, medieval Europe, had developed. Specifically, he was interested in administrative, governmental, and legal institutions and how they brought order and stability out of the fluid and frequently, in his eyes, chaotic conditions of a medieval society that, like the United States, long had open frontiers and cheap land for development. Haskins, and Strayer after him, saw strong parallels between medieval and American history. Through analysis of medieval administrative civilization, the American experience could be illuminated. The Wilsonian instrumentalist idea of the application of learned intelligence to government in a hitherto disordered society could be studied and affirmed in the medieval context. The capability of an educated elite to transform a violent society through standards of civility and law would be highlighted. Haskins was going to use medieval history both to explain the American experience and to confirm what became the Wilsonian program for American reform and advancement. Haskins was precisely William's contemporary, and there was much that was identical in the two men. A self-confidence slipping into arrogance, a deep American patriotism subtly intertwined with unbounded admiration for the British Constitution and political achievement, an unquestioning elitism and proclivity to see humankind in terms of superior and inferior races, yet a willingness to concede that the less fortunate people could learn from the more capable and advanced Northerners what might be called an open kind of hierarchic racism. Haskins spent a half dozen years in France, England, and Sicily, first getting the tools of medieval research in Paris and then traveling to archives in London, Rouen, Palmero to track the steps of the Norman French of the 11th century. He exhausted his substantial private resources in this learning and research processes. Haskins was convinced that the best thing to ever happen to England was the Norman conquest of 1066, by which William the Conqueror's government and the peculiar kind of centralized Norman feudalism brought hitherto disordered and backwards England a highly rational and effective political and judicial order. He put for himself the task of examining the formation of Norman institutions everywhere, and he studied the Sicilian situation as well as the English one because the Norman aristocracy had conquered that rich country after their invasion in 1016. Back and forth, Haskins went to the archives of France, England, and Sicily, building up his view of Norman institutions, his definitive work on the subject, which he finally published in 1918. Later, he gave a series of published public lectures at Harvard on the rise of the Normans, whom he called the supermen of the 11th century. After the articles, which later were collected in the 1918 book, began to appear, he was, in 1910, invited to teach at Harvard, and with the retirement of Harvard's professor of medieval history, Charles Gross, the first Jew to teach in the Harvard History Department and the last until 1940, Haskins in 1912 gained the senior chair in European history on the banks of the Charles River. Like Wilson, Haskins' interest in government was not merely historical and theoretical. He wanted very much to be involved in the practice of administration, and he relished the personal exercise of power. For more than a decade, he served with great distinction as the dean of the Graduate School of Harvard, elevating its prestige to the premium position in America, higher even than Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and the University of Chicago, which, when Haskins began at Harvard, were ahead of the old institution in Cambridge as centers of doctoral training. Woodrow Wilson saw in Haskins a replication of himself in every way, and he took Haskins with him to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and 1920 as one of his 3 personal advisors. The other 2 were his longtime confidant and hatchet man, Colonel Edward House, and another Harvard professor, Robert H. Lord. It was Lord who advised Wilson on the recreation of Poland out of the Russian Empire and pieces of eastern Germany. Haskins' main assignment was to study the situation in the Saar Valley mining region. He actively lobbied Wilson on behalf of the French claims to obtain the Saar. Haskins seconded Lord as the leading architect of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, 2 new states created by combining several smaller entities derived from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The 2 eminent Harvard professors had a bold vision of a reorganized Central Europe, placing the American principle of public instrumentality ahead of Central European nationalism and ethnic, linguistic, and religious particularism. Giving independence to every ethnic minority in the Balkans would create small states that would not be economically viable or politically functional. Haskins' view was that the need of these small societies to find economic prosperity and political stability would in time lead them to repress their national heritage in the interest of fiscal progress and administrative unity within the larger multi-ethnic states of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The United States was a multi-ethnic society. Why could not such a state work in the Balkans? Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, in spite of many vicissitudes, still exist. Haskins can be given credit for that measure of political foresight. In the short run, down to 1939, the Versailles Central European design, for which Haskins can claim a significant measure of authorship, worked poorly. Czechoslovakia had a great deal of industrial potential, but placing 3.5 million Sudeten Germans within this new state was a great risk, and Hitler took advantage of it to dismember Czechoslovakia in the late 1930s. He easily stimulated discontent among the large German minority in Czechoslovakia and then incorporated it into his Third Reich. At Munich in 1938, Hitler got Britain and France to recognize this takeover. As for Yugoslavia, it was an impoverished and backwards country down to World War II, and its 2 largest constituents, the Serbs and the Croats, disliked each other intensely. They still do. Ironically, it was the communist takeover in these 2 Versailles-centered states at the end of World War II, more than the planning of Haskins and Wilson, that brought a measure of stability to these 2 countries. How much of a success Haskins was as a designer of modern states rather than as a historian of medieval ones is hard to assess. But in both instances, Haskins followed the same principle. Politics was more important than culture. Back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Haskins in the early 1920s devoted himself to the founding of the Medieval Academy of America, the professional association for medievalists, and its establishment journal, Speculum. It was Haskins' belief that American medieval scholarship had come of age as the United States itself had become a power second to none in the world. And it was time to demonstrate this in the Medieval Academy with its elaborate, excruciatingly formal annual meetings and its journal, which was to be the equal of any journal of medieval scholarship in Europe. To demonstrate this, Speculum was printed on thick, high-quality paper, and its articles were to have footnotes whose length and opaque quality were second to none in the world. Around him, Haskins gathered a group of eager students from all over the country, especially from Ivy League colleges. He put them through a very rigorous training, similar to École des Chartes and the German Monumentia Institute. His graduate students were supposed to arrive in Harvard, Yale, already knowing the general course of medieval history and with mastery of Latin, French, and German. Haskins' seminar was a demanding regimen in the reading and interpreting of documents. His students had to be able to sight-read Latin documents, particularly administrative records, often in the form of photostats and manuscripts that Haskins handed out in his seminar. If you couldn't do this, or if you wanted a more speculative approach to the Middle Ages, you were gone. Haskins was an impatient and very demanding taskmaster who liked to push his students to the limit of exhaustion and frustration. But if they survived, he found them good jobs in leading universities where they imposed through the course of generations precisely the same regimen on their own students. At Princeton and Harvard today, the scope and method of training in medieval history that Haskins was using at Harvard half a century ago continue unabated and undiluted. At the same time, in the Wilsonian tradition of addressing a broad public by expounding humanistic ideals, Haskins loved to give public lectures and to write books addressed to wide audiences. His Normans in European History was published as one who loves France and takes a special interest in helping people to understand her, he wrote in a personal letter. Haskins, during his years of wandering through European archives on his own, had developed an interest in the learning of the 12th century, particularly in medieval science. It was now time to institutionalize that field as well. Haskins believed, as a good Wilsonian, that nothing should be left to personal idiosyncrasy, but should receive a perpetuating institutional form. In general, it seems to me, he wrote in 1922, that we have reached a point in the United States, both in scientific and historical studies, when some more definite effort should be made towards advancing the history of science, both as a field for investigation and as a scientific subject. Haskins' academic power broking was extended also in this direction, and he obtained funds to establish a chair in the history of science at Harvard. The first occupation of the chair was a very prolific French medievalist, Georges Sarton, the father of the novelist May Sarton. As in the case of Speculum, Isis, the new journal for the history of science that Haskins and Sarton started, eschewed speculative and highly interpretive articles and concentrated on publication of very detailed research reports based on archival studies. While wandering around European archives in the first decade of the century, Haskins had noticed a surprising number of manuscripts dealing with physics, cosmology, and mathematics. They were not simply derivations from the Greeks and the Arabs. They were often involved close reasoning, mathematical formulations, and diagrams. There was a technical side to medieval science as well as a speculative one. Haskins was a pioneer in studying this thick technical side of medieval science. The only chapter in Haskins' anti-Burckhardt project, The Renaissance of the 12th Century, that is still worth reading is one on the natural science. The only problem with this kind of history of science is that it tends to separate the physical science from the rest of culture and thought. The general place of science in medieval intellectual life is hard to fathom from this kind of close, technical analysis of medieval science that Haskins inaugurated. Haskins was an intense, dour, extremely hardworking man who succeeded completely in the program he set out for himself. He was an astute politician, avoided confrontations, and in that respect was more adept than his master Woodrow Wilson. He dominated medieval studies in the overwhelming manner symbolized by the naming of the Medieval Academy of America's highest prize, the Haskins Medal, after him. At academic conferences in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., or similar conclaves in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Madison, Wisconsin, he planted himself in the foyer and held court as his students and his president's students came to pay homage to the great man. He presided over a small, enclosed world of determined middle-class wasps, ruling unchallengedly before the German immigration of the late 1930s on the history of Roman Catholic Europe. American Catholic medievalists, a marginal and timid lot, dared not challenge him. But to give Charles Homer Haskins his due, he was a serious, idealistic man whose taste for power did not preclude a dispassionate recognition of good work by others, nor did he use his position to gain material advancement for himself. He lived simply and died a man of modest means. The Calvinist strain in Wilsonianism ran strong in Haskins' temperament. Haskins was very much typical of a certain kind of American academic of the first 3 decades of this century, the scholars and administrators who were mainly responsible for building the great graduate schools of arts and sciences that stretched from Cambridge, Massachusetts, through Chicago and Urbana, Illinois, and Madison, Wisconsin, to Berkeley, California. In 1900, there was very little in the United States to compare with the traditional European universities. Even Harvard wasn't much compared with Oxford, Berlin, or the Sorbonne. Madison was a cow college, Berkeley, an obscure training college set in a desiccated orange grove. By 1930s, the American universities as centers of learning and research were starting to enter world-class status. This is one of the most phenomenal chapters in the history of Western culture, and aside from Lawrence Vaisey's splendid book on the period down to 1914, it is a story that has not yet been well told. Haskins played a leading role in this development and was typical of the great academic entrepreneurs who, by force of stubborn will and manic energy, as well as shrewd political judgment, carried out this academic and intellectual revolution in the United States. The problem is that when Haskins came to write in 1928 The Renaissance of the 12th Century, which today is his only widely read book, he interpreted the intellectual and educational history of 12th century Europe far too much in the context of the American experience of his own generation. His book is largely an annotated catalog of authors, theologians, philosophers, translators, and scientists. Just as Chicago, Madison, and Berkeley came out of nowhere to become major centers of thought and learning between 1900 and 1930, and Harvard rose to transatlantic prominence from being just an undergraduate college, so Haskins thought that persistently multiplying names of writers and intellectuals could persuasively communicate the continuous growth of 12th 12th century thought. The American University of the 1920s was created by an act of will and steady multiplication of faculty and supportive resources. Haskins gives the impression that the 12th century Renaissance was a similar cumulative and straight-line expansionary development. Of course, it was in a sense, but that is a superficial external history, one that misses the inner dynamic and extremely complex ideological and emotional conflicts that distinguished 12th century culture. Haskins did not take this catalog approach to 12th century culture out of obtuseness or laziness. Rather, he did not want to delve into the inner tensions, conflicts, and turmoil that were even in his day clearly visible in 12th century thought and sensibility. A critical approach also raised too many disturbing implications for the American intellectual and social world of his time. The old American academic wasp, of whom there is no finer example than Charles Homer Haskins, were happy with their formidable accomplishments in building centers of learning comparable with Europe's. They did not want to complicate matters by contemplating the ideological divisions and moral issues within American culture. The shock of the Great Depression and New Deal shortly was to force this upon them, and Haskins projected this ironic, repressive reticence onto the intellectual life of the Middle Ages. In 1928, 3 years before a stroke incapacitated him, Haskins was happy to find a student who was in many ways a carbon copy of himself and would thoroughly continue his work. This was a Princeton graduate, Joseph Strayer. It was the Wilsonian Princeton legacy of high-minded humanistic scholarship and public service that Strayer represented, not the other Princetons of the riotous eating clubs on Prospect Street with their drunken brawls each Saturday night and the glamorous life enshrined in F. Scott's Fitzgerald, this side of paradise. Joe Strayer came from a Pennsylvania Dutch family. His father was George Strayer, a professor at Columbia's Teachers College for 30 years. Joe Strayer very closely resembled his father physically. George Strayer was a close associate of John Dewey and represented the American philosophy of instrumentalism, a social rationalism applied to the programmatic and persistent solution of social problems. In George Strayer's case, school curricula. Joe Strayer grew up in Morningside Heights in New York and hated it. He was graduate from the Horace Mann School, one of the best metropolitan private schools, and long a favorite with faculty parents at Columbia. It also had a long association with John Dewey and Teachers College. Strayer later never spoke of New York except with hatred and could not mention Columbia except in spiteful terms and with contempt. The contrast between the vanguard culture of Manhattan in the 1920s and the bleak Protestant rectitude of his family consisted a great strain for young Strayer and was resolved by his coming down entirely on the side of Wilsonian rationalism and elitism and against the culture of the Jazz Age. Strayer in the 1950s was fond of telling his students that the Jazz Age was an idle myth. He said he never experienced it. No doubt in a personal sense, that was true. The kind of work Haskins demanded of his graduate students was perfect for Strayer to shine in at Harvard. Close reading of administrative text for which only a limited Latin vocabulary was necessary. Strayer's command of Latin was always marginal. He probably could not read a philosophical or theological work written in ornate ecclesiastical Latin. And a patient's inductive approach, elucidating the operations of government from tax rolls and bureaucratic memorandums. Strayer was not a fast thinker, and he would not have done well in a group where high-level, rapid-fire speculation was the currency. He had no taste for art, music, or imaginative literature, and Haskins also had a small interest in these things. Strayer's Harvard dissertation, The Administration of Normandy under St. Louis, duly published by Haskins Medieval Academy, was a continuation of Haskins' Norman institutions. After the French reconquest of Normandy from the English crown in 1204, how did the French govern Normandy? More important, did the skillful institutions of Norman administration teach the zealous Roman lawyers of the French crown in the 13th century how to develop their own systems of administration and taxation? This was the subject of Strayer's dissertation. There was no clear answer to the second and more interesting question. When Strayer started teaching at Princeton in the early 1930s, he found himself under the shadow of a much more quick-witted and speculative medievalist, Lem White, who had done some important work on Italian monasticism and was now beginning his highly suggestive researches into medieval technology. The stirrup, which allowed a knight to hold and stab with the lance without falling off his horse, was one of the great inventions of all time, though, thought White, the windmill coming into use in the 12th century was a similarly revolutionary breakthrough and so forth. But fortunately for Strayer, in 1938, Lem White suddenly went off to head a women's college in California, leaving Strayer as the senior medievalist at Princeton. During the staff-starved wartime, he took over as the chairman of the history department, a position he retained for 2 decades. In the year after the war, Strayer rapidly built up the best department of European history in the country, perhaps in the world. It was also a department known for brilliant undergraduate teaching. This rare combination of great scholars and superb teachers was the fulfillment of Wilson's academic ideal, and the students responded accordingly. But the late 1950s, the Princeton History Department had more majors, including the artist Frank Stella, than any other department on the campus. The lectures of its classroom stars, E. Harris Jinks Harbison on the Reformation, Gordon Craig on modern Germany and diplomatic history, Eric Goldman, a former senior editor at Time, on recent United States history, were standing room only affairs. As Department Chairman Strayer used not only the Wilsonian ideal, but the Haskins method of intimidation, my way or the highway. Each year, he brought in 3 or 4 new PhDs, usually from Harvard, and in 3 years they were gone unless they gave exceptional promise of prolific publication and were superb in the classroom. Strayer listed the department mailboxes not only by rank, but by what he currently thought of his colleagues, especially the non-tenured ones. And there were not enough boxes for all the faculty. Each fall, a couple of assistant professors would find their mail tossed on the floor under the mailboxes. They knew then it was time to seek other jobs. But in the spirit of Wilsonian paternalism, Strayer would, if they had no jobs by January for the next academic year, pick up the phone and get them ones at good colleges. Ann Arbor especially became known as the Princeton Farm Club. Strayer's influence in the university as a whole loomed large. He was very close to the dean of faculty, J. Douglas Brown, the economist and New Deal Democrat, who in 1935 had helped devise the Social Security system. Strayer attended all monthly faculty meetings but never spoke at them and was very annoyed if any of his younger faculty in the history department spoke up. Strayer was about 5 feet 10 inches tall, stocky, square-built, with a large round face and sandy straight hair. He was a very mid-American face. He was a very neat man, always clean-shaven and freshly scrubbed. He had large, powerful hands with thick fingers, but I never saw him shake hands with anyone. His office desk was meticulously clean, even though because he was a chairman of a large department, dozens of administrative documents besides his research materials must have passed over it each week. During a seminar in his office, if he wanted to find a research document, he would open an old-fashioned wooden filing cabinet, pull out a file, and immediately find the document he was looking for. The walls of his office were lined from floor to ceiling with books, carefully placed by subject matter, never a slip of paper showing from any of them. When I knew him in the 1950s, Strayer was a very heavy chain smoker of cigars, and in addition, he would solicit an occasional cigarette from a student during the seminar. He had no small talk, and in his company, several minutes of total silence could pass. The large tumble-down house that he rented from the university for a nominal sum was stocked with a miscellany of unfashionable, beat-up furniture and the kinds of pictures you can buy at Kmart. Strayer's approach to the governance of the history department was identical to that to which his favorite medieval king, Philip the Fair of France, who died in 1314, ruled his expanded domains. There was a facade of a meeting of the whole department faculty at the beginning of each semester, like Philip the Fair's occasional meetings of the Estates General. The purpose was not discussion or approval, but dissemination of information. Strayer wrote several articles arguing that medieval representative assemblies, even the English Parliament, were not deliberative bodies, but occasions for the dissemination of information. The main information disseminated at history department meetings was the preceptorial assignments to the non-tenured faculty, which were given out one day before the start of classes. There were gasps of shock and horror as assistant professors found themselves teaching in fields very far from their areas of expertise. Strayer thereby tested their adaptability and institutional commitment. Strayer taught graduate students in the Haskins manner by intimidation and by concentration on narrow research study of administrative records. He spent 2 years, 1951 to 1953, doing nothing else in the seminar but reading medieval tax rolls, first of England, then of France. When I proposed that I do a report on the Thomist idea of kingship, he told me I should consider transferring to the philosophy department. Sure, that is part of medieval history, he said glowingly through his inevitable cigar, but the philosophers will never study tax rolls. If we historians don't do it, nobody will, so we have to do it. There was a logic in this, after a fashion. Once Strayer said to me with unusual explicitness, "Cantor, in 3 weeks you will do a report on how St. Louis raised the money for his crusade." I worked night and day for 3 weeks, including the intervening Easter vacation. I thought I was ready. "Well, Cantor," he said, rubbing his cheek with a pipe that he seemed to keep around for that purpose, "how many documents on the subject did you find?" "5, I replied. "Not very good," he said. "There are 7. Of course, one is unpublished. I found it in a Parisian archive, but the other is published. You should have found it." It turned out the document was published in southern France in 1893 in an obscure journal, long extinct. It was in the library, however. If I had really been a first-rate researcher, I would have found the document. Strayer never turned on the overhead lights in his office during a seminar. The seminar met for 3 hours at 2 o'clock p.m. The office was a long, narrow room with only one window. By 4 o'clock p.m. in the winter, it was so dark that it was impossible to read one's notes. One day I had the gall to ask Strayer why he didn't turn on the lights. So you dummies will not be able to bore us by reading your verbose notes and will have to speak succinctly from memory. A good lesson. Strayer's own approach to scholarship was particular. The seminar was devoted to the most excruciating minutiae of medieval administration, but he wanted us, after we had mastered this, to give only the significance, the general import of our research materials. He had a mania against proper names. What's the difference, he said once in a fury, whether it was the damned Earl of Leicester or the Earl of Gloucester? How did the son of a gun pay his taxes? When I started precepting for him, taking the discussion sections tied to his undergraduate lectures on the High Middle Ages, I was stunned by the brilliance and beautiful organization of his lectures. He was not, like Harbison, Craig, and Goldman, a showman, but each lecture was crystal clear and thoroughly memorable. He made even the most complex things in medieval government and law come alive. His mania against proper names went to extreme lengths in his lectures. He went into contortions trying to avoid using more than one proper name per lecture. He would say the French king, an English lord, an early 13th century pope, but would not use an actual name unless he was going to speak about that person for at least half a lecture. Having Strayer as a dissertation advisor was a unique experience. In the 4 years I worked on the thing, I talked to him about it a total of 30 minutes, 29 of which occurred when I started. 18 months later, I sent him 2 chapters from England. 3 weeks later, I got them back. On top of the first chapter, he'd written, "You must do better." That was all. After 4 years, I brought him the 450-page manuscript. "What's this?" he said. "My dissertation." "I thought you submitted it last year." "Well, I will take it home tonight and read it. Come back tomorrow morning and I will tell you what I think." When I told his secretary why I'd come, she buzzed him. He did not invite me into his office, but came out into the secretary's office and handed me back the dissertation. "It's okay," he said. "We will set up a defense." Then he turned around and went back into the office and closed the door. He never said another word to me about it. In the 1950s, Strayer fulfilled the Wilsonian idea of public service and international commitments by working for the Central Intelligence Agency for several years. He was personally recruited by the CIA director himself, Allen Dulles, who was a Princeton alumnus. For at least 5 summers, Strayer spent 5 days a week at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and during the year he would go down whenever there was a crisis somewhere in the world. If there was upheaval in Lebanon or Pakistan or wherever, I would wait at home by the phone, and sure enough, at 10 p.m., Strayer would phone and say, "I have to go to Washington tomorrow. Please take my lecture and my preceptorals." Then he would tell me the subject of the lecture. Usually that presented no problem. Sometimes I had to stay up most of the night writing a lecture on an unfamiliar topic. When Strayer got back in a day or two, he would summon me to his office and ask me to repeat the lecture to him word for word. I once had the temerity to ask what he was doing for the CIA and why it found the services of medievalists so important. The response was that Allen Dulles knew medievalists were used to drawing conclusions from fragmentary evidence, and that is just what the CIA did. It was rumored that Strayer was one of Dulles' chief advisors. It was evident that Strayer read many intelligence reports on the Soviet Union because he was fond of mentioning the Soviet government in his lectures. "Dictatorships and totalitarian regimes don't last very long," he said, "no matter how fierce and oppressive they are. It is a very inefficient system, and eventually even the people on top get tired of it, and the system loosens up or falls apart entirely." He predicted that in time the Soviet system would change, that Stalinism would be superseded. Of course, he has been proven right in that prediction. It happened just the way he said it would. Strayer's universe was one in which good administration and law made everything else possible, and the good political system was a highly centralized one in the hand of the learned elites. But it was not a closed system. It had to respond to change, to the needs and feeling of the people, and allow for a substantial degree of social mobility. This sounded like England under Henry II or France under Philip the Fair, and those were the medieval governments he most admired. Essentially, they were a mirror of the New Deal and its successors, a group of well-educated, public-spirited, uncorrupted but power-hungry bureaucrats who worked on behalf of society's welfare as they perceived it. It was directly in the Wilsonian tradition. Strayer was not a political conservative in the ordinary sense of the term. He always voted for Democrats. He held the Republicans in low esteem. Even when under Eisenhower and Allen Dulles, he was employed by a Republican administration. He had no quarrel with the welfare state, but he was paternalistic, elitist, authoritarian within certain bounds and restraints, mostly self-imposed. Strayer represents a great generation in American life, the generation that followed the Wilsonian tradition in creating the regulatory and welfare state, in raising American universities to the highest level in the world, and in guiding the United States to world hegemony. We shall not see such giants again in this country. Among other impediments, the Vietnam disaster and the rise of the New Left eroded self-confidence in the United States as a special agency of history or God and as destiny's darling. Strayer belonged to the generation of unwavering faith in American exceptionalism. That now seems long past. A chasm has opened with that Wilsonian past. Wow, guys, thanks for hanging on while I read that section there. It took me a little longer than I thought that it would, but the conclusions more or less write themselves. I mean, Haskins worked for Woodrow Wilson and was responsible in large part for the reorganization of Europe after World War I, and Strayer worked for the CIA. There could not be more perfect libertarian parallels, especially for those of us who are very skeptical about the accomplishments of Wilson's administration. So I hope that you got something out of that on this Thanksgiving Day. Now, the conclusion that I want to draw from this is really a historical one. Our modern categories, the way that we perceive the world in our social and political context, which we often take for granted, like our worldview, the lens through which we understand the world, are deeply they're all deeply subjective, right? Like none of us can step outside of history and perceive reality for what it actually is. All that we can try to do is work within our cultural context to limit those biases, to try to be a little bit less subjective in the way that we perceive the world. And when it comes to history, our modern categories often subconsciously condition the way that we understand the past. And it's very clear by looking at the work of Haskins and Strayer that that was exactly what was happening. And I think that that same critique could also be applied to C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and it is in this exact same book. The social and cultural context of these historians determine the work that they do in history, and then that also kind of produces this matrix of knowledge that popular culture will then use to filter out their understandings of what happens in history. And one of the points that I always make, and this is why I'm such a proponent of biblical historical criticism and not just doing abstract systematic theology, is that we have to be very careful when we're reading history that we're not actually reading our own experience into history. And I think that we have to take it both as a starting point and for granted as we're doing historical research, that people that lived in eras previous to our own cannot possibly share our worldview. And so we have to try to put those elements of our worldview aside that might obscure our research into history so that we can see how people would have thought and why they acted in the way that they acted without anachronistically importing all of our modern historical categories back into history. Now, again, we do this with the Bible all the time. This has been one of the major themes of this show. I'm not saying that systematic theology is completely illegitimate. I'm not saying that at all. But we have to have both textual criticism, being able to reconstruct the original Greek and Hebrew text of the Bible. That has to be the number one priority. And then number two, we have to have historical criticism, analyzing the Bible in the context of the ancient world in which it was written, acknowledging that a lot of the thought categories and the thought patterns and the cultural and social and political and theological context of those writers of the Bible was radically different than our own. I mean, even if you believe that someone like Paul was verbally dictated his letter to the Romans by God, it was still written to the Romans, right? And it was not written to 21st century Americans. So we have to analyze a text like Romans within its own historical context. And this is exactly the point that Albert Schweitzer makes in The Quest for the Historical Jesus, that when it comes to the production of historical Jesus research, we have to be careful that we're not just importing our own ideas and desires back onto Jesus, which is very easy to do. And I have that whole episode where I go over Henry Cadbury's book, The Perils of Modernizing Jesus, where he deals with that problem head on. And then also in this book, Inventing the Middle Ages, Norman Cantor does a good job of explaining how these medievalists just project their own worldview back into history. There's another really great book on the Middle Ages. And honestly, if you want to read one modern book on the Middle Ages that kind of explains everything, Dan Jones, who's just a great popular historian, he has a book called Powers and Thrones. And he makes the point in that book, which is a real challenge for me as a history teacher who has to teach feudalism as a standard. But he makes the point in his book that feudalism feudalism as it is explained by modern medievalists probably never existed in history. It is a construct that we place back into history, and that we have to be more sensitive to the fact that these ideas that we have about history might not actually represent the way that people thought and acted in the past. We also, again, as I said, have to be very sensitive towards the way that we study the Bible. And again, like whether you're studying the Middle Ages or whether you're studying the Roman Empire, whether you're studying, Genesis or whatever it is, it by default cannot affirm our modern political or scientific beliefs, because all of these historical documents that we have are documents that are embedded in the historical and cultural context of those that produce them. And so, like, our post-Enlightenment modern Western world and our thought categories of science and historiography are not the thought categories that people in the ancient world are going to have. And if we fail to realize that, then we will always misread history and we do that at our own peril. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this special Thanksgiving episode of the show today. Got to talk about a lot of issues that are near and dear to my heart. Got to read the section of this really, really great book. I do love medieval history. It's kind of my it's not my side hobby. It's my job, the thing that I get paid to do. But it's really great to have an opportunity to talk about this on the show. I really appreciate you guys hanging on. This is the longest special episode I've ever done. Could have been a full-length episode, but I feel just with the subject area that it's probably best that I release this as a special halfway through the week cycle. So, as always, you can check out my podcast every Tuesday. It drops on all the podcast streams and on the Libertarian Christian Institute's website. And once or twice a month, I'll throw you guys something extra like this to enjoy. I hope that you really enjoy and appreciate the rest of your Thanksgiving, and I appreciate you guys listening to this episode. Thank you, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.